public comment, but we also have a way for you to also submit it to the committees themselves and to your representatives. So make an effort to look on there as we go live, and we are live now. So welcome everyone to our apartments rescheduled, strange, weird weather discussion that we can now have today. And I am so glad that we are having this discussion. Andrew, I want to welcome you. We haven't formally met, so this is going to be our first time as well to meet with each other and to see each other from afar. But I'm glad that you're here. Of course, you learned a lot about Texas over the last week. We've made the news a lot for weather issues that we are still working our way through. The discussion today is going to be focused on accessing apartments, a little bit of what I saw that you discussed with vertical canvassing, which is what we're going to be talking about today too. But it's also very important. Right now, we are dealing with not only an energy crisis, but a water crisis in Texas. And over the last few days, the county party with other organizations has had to do this kind of hard work of knocking doors, going up steps, making sure people are okay, not just for voting, but for vital community contact. So I'm glad we're having this discussion now, but it's sort of, it really brings home how important it is to get in the field, even in a pandemic, to get the word out about what's happening and to reach people. So I am so happy to be able to welcome you and to welcome the 60 plus people who are on our webinar right now, plus those that are streaming and watching the live stream now. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew. Without further ado, I saw your presentation briefly at another conference. I tracked you down because I thought we could benefit from your knowledge. So if you would just take a quick moment before we get into your discussion to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Excellent, Joanna. Thank you very much for the kind words. I'm very glad to be here. My name is Andrew Verdon. I created the apartment access program for then U.S. Representative Keith Ellison, now Attorney General Keith Ellison, back in the 2012 cycle. It's something that was then expanded for the city elections in Minneapolis in 2013. In 2014, it was moved statewide. We use this tool very effectively in order to help defeat a constitutional amendment to require photo ID in order to be able to vote. We also used it to turn out folks to prevent marriage being defined as between one man and one woman. This is a great tool to reach a lot of people who are otherwise difficult to reach. And you find it's very effective. It's probably the best way that your candidate could be spending their time. And using this, using a legal strategy of putting an ordinance in place is going to help allow that to happen, such that your candidates aren't getting thrown out of buildings, building managers aren't getting all worked up, that the residents aren't getting worked up. And frankly, you're reaching voters who are otherwise going to be very difficult to reach because there is not only the demographics of who the people are that live in an apartment building, but there's also a question of access. If you are a canvasser and you're trying to get into a building, you actually have to get past the front door, the doorman, or the concierge or whatever in order to be able to get into the building to have that face-to-face conversation with an individual resident. So I think you'll find this is a tremendously powerful organizing tool. Happy to kind of walk you all through the steps in order to set something like this. If you'd like further consultation on the matter, I am available. So
Yeah.
But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I really want to share the knowledge because I think you'll find it to be a very powerful tool as well. I've spoken with some other state parties about this now since that conference that Joanna mentioned. And so I'd really like to see this spread around the country because I think this would be a very powerful tool for progressive campaigns and issues.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that everybody does know that you're based in Minnesota. And
that is correct.
But the issues of getting into high-rise apartments, dealing with building managers, it's sort of universal. And you found a successful way of doing this. So I really think that you can bring a new perspective. Of course, we're going to have a lot of questions. We feel that Texas is different, but in viewing just easy access issues, it is universal. Dallas is quite large. In fact, I'll let you know that I looked it up. We have roughly 734,000 apartment units in Dallas County right now, with almost 24,000 more under construction. So we have a lot of access issues here. So I'm going to let you get started and keep introducing yourself, but I did want to give people that point of reference from where you're from.
Great, I appreciate that. So if you want to, if whoever is working the tech would like to pull up the presentation, I think this is probably the best way to do it. And we can talk about how this works. So I really do believe that apartments are the Shangri-La because it's, if you have a law in place, it'll make it easier to make sure that your candidates have good experience, that your volunteers have good experiences, that the residents at the apartment building have a good experience because they're not being caught unaware when they get a knock at the door at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. And frankly, the opposition is not going to bother to do this type of field work. This is very, very labor intensive. This takes a lot of planning. And that's not necessarily something that campaigns do or need to know, like, oh, we're going to be at this particular precinct and ward on this particular day, because if it's single family homes, it doesn't actually matter. You don't need anyone's permission to be there and to be able to approach the owner or the whoever the resident of that address. Whereas with apartments, it does take a lot of pre-planning, you know, building your lists, reaching the building, setting up the appointments with the candidate, training your canvassers because the canvas itself is different, following up with the building post canvas to make sure that they're still happy with the way things went so that they will let you in the next time you come around. So yeah, so please feel free, everybody, if you know, you have a question, unmute yourself or identify yourself in the chat with a question, and we will stop and we'll answer any questions that you have. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is me and my buddy Paul Wellstone. He is my political mentor. I worked for him as an intern in his office when I was a senior in college, February of 1996. I think this was during the Newt Gingrich federal government shutdown that I got this picture taken. I was an intern in his office. My boss quit 2 weeks later. I'm still friends with him. He insists that his quitting had nothing to do with me starting. So I ended up taking his job as an international constituent advocate in Paul's office. I worked my first campaign that summer, his first reelect in '96. I spent some time out in the wilderness, and then worked for a number of other political candidates. Field is my specialty. Field is my thing, and apartments in particular are my jam. So go ahead to the next one, please. So just our agenda for this evening, I'll give you a little more on my personal introduction, a little more on my campaign background. We'll talk about why it is that apartments matter. We'll talk about some tips and techniques in order to canvass apartments more effectively. And we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. Again, you do not have to hold your questions until the end if something pops into your brain right away. Next slide, please. So I went to small liberal arts college here in St. Paul, Minnesota, called McAllister College, double major in history and communication studies. And then got my master's in public affairs from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, graduating in 2011. And I've been working in the public sector ever since. Next slide, please. So just some of my background here, campaign experience. As I mentioned, I worked for Paul Wellstone, first in his office as a constituent advocate, and then later as a volunteer on his re-election campaign. In 2008, I worked for Barack Obama as a field organizer in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which then in 2009 got me to switch from my dabbling in the private sector. And I determined I wanted to make my career in the public sector, following the footsteps of my father, who was a diplomat in the U.S. State Department for 40 plus years. So in 2010, I was first a recruiting specialist, recruiting assistant, I guess was my title officially. I was helping recruit people for the 2010 census, and then later was a field operations supervisor. My territory included downtown Minneapolis, so I had to fight with apartment fight with access and apartments and apartment owners and managers and such. That's how I got to be the apartment guy. So then in 2012, I went and worked for Congressman Keith Ellison. They had determined that they needed a apartment program, although they did not have an apartment plan. They first tried it in the 2010 election, but they did not have a program. What they had was a couple buildings that they knew how to sneak into. But that's not the same as a program. And I think what you're looking for, what DCDP is looking for, is a systematic program. So this is replicable in all cities in the county. You should be doing this in other Democratic leaning areas of the state as well, because people who are living in apartments are our people. We'll get into the demographics later, but you have a better understanding for that. So in 2014, I took time off from my job at the state legislature, and I was the apartment program manager for the Minnesota Democratic Party. In 2015, I was on Bernie Sanders' advance campaign. I traveled with him. I did his rallies west of the Mississippi. In fact, I was at his first Dallas rally in, I think that was June or July of 2015 as well. I've got a funny story there where I was sent to go pick up Bernie Sanders from the airport, and I went to the airport and I'm looking for him. The campaign manager's yelling at me, "Where are you? Where are you?" Turns out that I had been told to go to the wrong airport. I didn't know that Southwest was only Love Field. So Bernie had to take a yellow cab to get to downtown Dallas, and I got in trouble because I had gone to the wrong airport, even though I'm not from Texas. How was I supposed to know? I literally just flew in from Phoenix that morning. So never thought it was a great idea that they send me to go pick up the senator. But there's my Dallas Bernie story for you. 2018 through 2020. So for approximately 2 3/4 years, I was the director of census operations and engagement for the state of Minnesota. Did not work for the federal government, but worked for the state itself. Minnesota ended up with the #1 overall self-response rate in the country. 75.1% of all Minnesotans self-completed their forms. We were #1, and the gap between us and second place was 4 times greater than in 2010. So that was good. And now I'm currently working for the Minnesota Emergency Operations Center as a state incident commander, working on COVID response. So I've been doing that. I haven't had a weekend off since MLK weekend, so I'm very excited that this weekend I get to catch up on sleep and laundry. It's gonna be amazing. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about this. Why do apartments matter, right? So now these are Minnesota specific numbers, but I'm guessing that the percentages are probably fairly similar. In Minnesota, 45% of all people not born in the United States who live in Minnesota live in renter households. It's approximately 200,000. 65% of Black Minnesotans are renters. 32% of Asian Minnesotans are renters. 46% of Latinx Minnesotans are renters. 40% of young adults aged 18 to 24 are renters. And 30% of children under 5 are renters. Now, obviously, these are not all categories that are relevant when you're talking about the electoral field. Children under 5, obviously not voting, but young adults certainly are. Communities of color absolutely are for those that are eligible to vote, and foreign born also a very high percentage there. So these are general renter numbers, not specific to apartments, but most, at least here in Minnesota, most people who live in apartments are also renters. So these percentages go through, carry through for apartments as well.
Yeah.
So the main problem with apartments, of course, is a matter of access, because there's a gatekeeper. There's someone in the way of you speaking directly to the person who lives in apartment 1B or 1C. You have to get through the front door, or you have to get past a concierge desk, whatever. They're double doors. It's secured access. It's like a vertical block, right? Instead of, if your candidate is going to go knock a cul-de-sac in a suburb, your candidate doesn't need permission to go knock on those doors. They can knock and the person can choose to answer or not to answer. But with apartment buildings, you have to get in through the front door of the building before you can even get permission from the person at the door to say, to ID them, to make sure that they're registered to vote, to persuade them, and then later on get them out to vote when it comes to the elections. So that is why apartments matter. Any questions popping up in the question field or chat box or anything that I should be aware of?
Yeah, so Zach, can you lower the slide a little bit so we can take a couple of questions? So, or Priscilla, turn off screen share. Folks are asking, will the slides be available? Would you make those available, Andrew?
100%, absolutely.
So let me look at a couple of questions, see if we have any good ones here. I will say one of the first questions that I have is dealing with the double doors. So it's not just a matter of accessing the doors. In Dallas County, we have very large, sometimes corporate ownership of apartments, not uncommon, but it's also not uncommon for, in particular, a company in the Dallas County area that last cycle refused to allow any canvassing, but also was advocating one particular party and a particular candidate that the company ownership supported. And they put their signs in front of the apartment complex. I mean, this was very clear. These were friends of the candidate, financial supporters of the candidate, and that was it. I mean, it was blatant. So have you come across that where you see partisan apartment ownership happening?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I see this in electoral politics, and I saw this in the census, where in the census, when we would visit a particular building, the apartment manager or owner would try to make a Faustian bargain with us to say, I'll let you in the front door, but you have to tell me how many people actually live in apartment 3C. I think they're, either because they're violating their lease because they've got too many people there, or if it's, rent controlled, or if it's Section 8 or something, folk that, it's that household is making too much money in order to be able to live in this apartment. So there's actually like a ceiling, right? And so the owners are desperate to get actual information on who lives there. And so they want to do that. I absolutely find this in instances where it's a corporate owned building or even a rich single sole proprietor who says, yeah, we don't want Democrats to come in our building. This, we're going to prevent people from coming through because the socioeconomic and racial identity of the person owning the building may not match that of the people living inside the building. And they don't want campaigns to activate and motivate their residents against their own financial interests. And this is where getting a law in place on a county level or a city level is going to be tremendously helpful, because then it's a simple matter of violation. It's did you or did you not let us in the building? If you didn't, then there's a fine, and we'll keep coming back. And this is one thing I will say to you. I'll say to everyone on this call, if you really want this to work, if you put this statute in place, you need to find candidates who are willing to take these folks to task. So, keep sending your candidate back, keep sending the campaign back, keep racking up those fines for that particular owner. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but you need to be willing to make an example of a non-compliant entity in order for the others to take you seriously, to be able to get in there.
Yeah, so I would say that one of the things that we would have to look up in the Dallas County area would be what our ordinances are with regards to this type of work. I will say, in the instance that I can think of, was an apartment complex doing this, because they put signage out for the candidate and then refused to let anyone else put signage in their apartment at all. That was a way that people were able to at least negotiate with the ownership. But it took a long time, and there was threats issued by the company itself that if there was signage up, then that would be a lease violation, even though they had a giant 4x4 in front of the leasing office.
Sure. Well, and that is a good area for negotiation, and say, okay, either we all have free speech or none of us have free speech. I think is a good position. Now, Minnesota state law that guarantees candidates and campaigns access to buildings does not address matters of signage and such. Our law is specifically addressed to access, but that's certainly something worthy to explore as well.
Yes. So I have another question here. It's twofold. What about solicitation? Most apartment complexes have signs that say no solicitation. I've seen it on homes too.
Yeah.
We have, in general, proceeded forward because I am not soliciting. Because I have the name of a voter. I'm
Correct.
knocking on the door asking for a particular person. I
Correct.
don't believe that is not solicitation. Is that
That
how
is
you all proceeded?
That is absolutely not solicitation, and this is a matter, and if you need to frame it as such, I'm guessing there may be some lawyers on this call right now, but this is a matter of free speech. This is a matter of First Amendment. This is political organizing. We have the right to do it. Solicitation would be if the DCDP was going from building to building and soliciting and asking, like selling your T-shirts or selling raffle tickets or asking for folks to join up and sign up to be members. I think that would fall in the solicitation category. This is literally about, we are calling to make, we're coming by to make sure that this person still lives here. We're calling to identify them on the issues, see where they stand on the issues, want to make sure their voter registration is up to date. And we want to find out what issues they're into so that we can do targeted mailings and phone calls and such targeted to them later on. And then when it comes to GOTV, we can get them out to vote. So absolutely do not. You'll hear that a lot. I hear that more from on the high end from like the condo owners and such as well. Our condo rules say you're not allowed to solicit in here. It's like, great. Well, my state law trumps your condo law. So, and we would make sure to make examples of those businesses, of the condos or buildings that did not want to comply. I made it my life's mission to make sure that that was the very next building that the congressman was going to go visit, or that the very next, county commissioner or state legislator or state senator was going to visit, or park board member or city council member or mayor. We were going to send someone high up the food chain into that place to show the residents how important they are, and also to show the management that we're not messing around.
So how did you kind of tell me the tone of what we're talking about here? Because I do feel, are we going to be aggressive? Are we trying to sweet talk apartment managers? Are we trying to do both? I mean, there is a level of negotiation where you have a human in front of you, and being nice may get a door open. Being hardball may not. Or is it both?
I think it was FDR that said, "Talk softly and carry a big stick." I think that is the best approach for getting in apartments. You want to start on a conciliatory manner. When we get into this later in the presentation, literally a step by step, what I would do is I would call the building 48 hours, 72 hours before the canvas itself, and I would say, we're going to be in your area on Saturday, and candidate X is planning on coming to your building. I'd like to know, who do we need to speak with in order to facilitate a smooth visit on that particular date and time. Sometimes we get the, oh, that's, we don't allow solicitations, or, we're not interested. As well, it's actually not a matter of interest. It's a matter of state law that you're required to let them in. I'll tell you what, how about you give me your contact information? I'm going to send you an email that's going to have the state statute in it, which clearly lays out what your obligations are as a building, what our obligations as a campaign are. And then I'm going to give you a call back, and then we're going to set up our visit at 10 o'clock on Saturday, and we just push right through. So, when it's I need to check with our lawyers, or I need to check with our boss, or we're not interested. I mean, that's when we were like, okay, we're definitely coming at 10 o'clock on Saturday then, because they don't get to choose when the only time that a building can say no to us, essentially in Minnesota, is if they have extenuating circumstances. Like we had this situation once downtown Minneapolis. We called to do our confirmation on a Friday night, and they said, we just had a fire last night and 6 of our floors are experiencing water damage right now. It would be very, very inconvenient if you wanted to come through right now. If you want to come, you can, but we'd prefer that you reschedule for another time. And we did that. The way the Minnesota law is written says that the not the building itself and not the owner of the building is responsible for the penalty, but the person themselves who says no to you, they're the ones who's responsible for paying the petty gross misdemeanor. So that's a situation where you can try to get yourself on the same side of the table with the whether it's the security person or the rental consultant or whatnot, to say, look, guys, I didn't write this law. The law says that you have to let me in. And if we take you to court over this, it's not ABC companies that's going to have to pay for it. You, Joe Smith, are going to have to pay for it. Do you want to pay this fine on behalf of your owner? No, I didn't think so. So let's make this work. And we had some pre-printed materials that we could provide the buildings so that they could duly notify the residents this was happening. This is also why you do it in advance and not just show up at the door at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning and say, we're here, let us in. That you give them some notice so they can jump through their hoops. They can notify their residents. We make sure that it's a smooth process all the way through.
So we've had a lot of questions about Texas law. We are going to put answers in the chat for those that are from Texas. Texas law is unclear, but we're going to give you an example of that for those that are reading in the chat. It's unclear, but it's also unclear on the part of the owner. So if what we could do is at the end of it possibly leverage a fine against someone, what we're also hoping for is that a condo owner or an apartment complex major developer wouldn't issue a fine back. Texas law with regards to all of this is unclear on purpose sometimes. It makes it difficult for us to manage too. How do I negotiate when I don't even know where I stand? And they take advantage of that. They absolutely take advantage of that. Some of them behave threateningly or act like they're going to do something to the campaign. Or if you have a precinct chair who is just surrounded by a complexes, they have no where to go sometimes when they think they have nothing to get a hold of. So I think perhaps one of the follow-ups that we will have with you, Andrew, is sort of look at our Dallas County local ordinances. That is a good place for us to start, and Texas law, as well as how the Texas Democratic Party has handled this, so that we have the law on our side and at least know where to point, because it is unclear. And sometimes it's about who's the most aggressive at the moment, them or you. Another question that someone had was also about gated communities. It's still an access issue.
It's still an access issue, and the law in Minnesota, it pertains to multi-unit dwellings. So that applies to duplexes and quadplexes and 20-unit buildings and 2,000-unit buildings. So it includes everything. Gated community, you should be able to still get into gated communities. Now, I wouldn't. The reason I mean, you know your situation best, and maybe you do want to include gated communities in the legislation or in the statute. I would myself, I did not use this law to get into gated communities. I was the term I used working on the Ellison campaign was I was a vertical organizer, because my residents lived on top of each other. But there are some pretty bourgeois areas of Minnesota as well, and we just blasted right through those, just like we would any other place. We have a right to be here. This is political organizing. Folks say, I'm going to call the cops. They're great, good, we'll be waiting. Excellent, please do so. But having it laid out in statute is really important. I'll tell you what, if you do get this statute in place, communicating with the let's say apartment building owner or rental building owner association in Dallas County will be tremendously helpful, because when this law has been on the books for close to 50 years in Minnesota, and Minnesota is fairly unique. I'm not aware of another state that has a law which expressly says that candidates must be granted access to multi-unit buildings. So we leverage that, and then we communicate with the trade association who's in charge of, whose members are the owners of these apartment buildings. And we always make sure that we get a kind of a letter to the editor kind of thing for them to put out and say after Labor Day, before an election, that says, these are your obligations as an apartment owner to let these people in. This is what we will defend. This is what we won't defend. This is what the obligations of the campaigns are. And then we provided the apartment program managers contact information. So if buildings had specific questions or concerns or complaints, they had someone that they could reach out to and say, hey, your folks came through my building and you know, broke the elevator, or we're making too much noise, or we're there late at night, or whatever the problem is. So that would be my recommendation, and a good way to kind of smooth over. It also becomes that trade association can become like a third party validator for you. So you don't have to say, I'm Joanna with the Dallas County Democratic Party, I'd like you to do this. You could say, hey, here's a copy of the statute, and here's what your own trade association says about it. They say you need to comply. Here you go. And when you pitch this to the trade association, essentially the pitch is, hey, we're doing this because we want to make this easy for you. We don't want our folks coming through your building without the acknowledgement of your management. We don't want your residents to be surprised if they're getting a knock at the door. Your residents, of course, have the right to say no to speaking to any political candidate. And if we tell them in advance that we're going to be in your building between 1 and 3, and if you do not wish to speak to the candidate, then don't answer your door at that time. Or if you wish to give that candidate a piece of your mind, get ready, because they're coming at 1 o'clock. And so this is without question the best use of time for field for any of your candidates, because a candidate for us, you can only get into a building if you have a candidate, but you don't need a candidate to go knock a single family home neighborhood or cul-de-sac in the suburbs. So the candidates, for reasons of density and demography and access, if they're going to knock any doors, the ones they should be knocking are ones at apartment buildings.
Yeah, so we had a question come in here. What is the best approach to canvass in an apartment complex where it's considered high crime? How would you approach that? How did you approach that?
We have a fair number of those here in Minnesota. I guess what I would say is that we're always canvassing floors in pairs of 2 at a minimum. So that unlike knocking in a single family home neighborhood where one person can be on one side of the street, the other person's on the other side of the street, in an apartment building, you literally have 2 people right next to each other going down the hall. One person is knocking on the person's door who's in the voter file. That is, we believe we know who lives at apartment 1C, and then their partner is knocking all the doors that the A person is not knocking at. So in that sense, I would say that knocking apartment buildings in even high crime areas, it's safer doing it this way than not doing it at all, or sending people out in solos. I mean, we would dispatch a team of 4 or 6 into a building, and you can knock it out very, very quickly. Also get a lot of voter registrations, voter identifications, and it's just a great way to build relationships with the folks who live in those buildings.
Yeah. So we're still looking up some of I'm getting them to post a couple of good links for the chat for the folks that keep asking about what's the Texas state law, because it is unclear where our state and our county ordinances and Sydney ordinances land. Dallas County is in multiple cities, which becomes a little difficult when we're trying to negotiate what our laws are. When you began this program, how many people did you bring to the table to get it done? Were you working just my campaign and we're going to push it through, or were you working with organizations, county parties, state parties, and saying, we're going to approach together as a team? How did you do that most effectively? Because I feel that apartment associations here are going to say, yeah, I don't need to be contacted by the 17 people who are running for city council in Dallas. That's not going to happen. I want to talk to 3 key players that represent, for us, like county party represents a whole silo of people, and maybe a nonpartisan voting rights organization, or the Texas Civil Rights Project, for instance, that is about voting rights. Is that the best way to do it?
So the way it was done here in Minnesota was the 5th congressional district, which was Representative Ellison's district, which includes Minneapolis and the western suburbs. I worked for him. I guess technically I was with the Minnesota Democratic Party, but I worked for Keith. Keith was the one who paid my salary, and Keith was the chief organizer. And then all of the other lower offices all filtered through Keith. So Keith called a meeting of all the elected officials, all the Democratic elected officials and candidates in his congressional district. And he said, all right, guys, we're going to finally do it. We're putting together a plan to get into apartment buildings. This is Andrew. He's going to explain to you the plan. And then afterwards, you're all going to sign up for specific shifts of when you're going to be knocking doors with Andrew and his team. and we're going to set up a regular schedule, and we'd like you to adhere to this schedule. And if you do so, we will carry each other's lit. We will ID for each other. We will all work together if you are part of this plan. But you're either all in or you're all out. You can't use this plan to just drop your lit but not drop mine, right? It's got to be like a concerted effort. So it's like a unified Democratic Party structure. So
yeah, we're going to head back to the presentation now.
Yep.
So that.
Yep. I saw that comment in the in the chat. So
yeah, let's get back to it.
So we'll go through a couple slides, and then we'll pause for some questions. So this is the Minnesota State Statute. For those of you who are on your mobile device, it's Minnesota State Statute 211B-20. I should have that tattooed on my arm because that is kind of I've built my life around that statute for the last 9 years. It is unlawful for a person either directly or indirectly to deny access to an apartment house, dormitory, nursing home, manufactured home park, or other multiple unit facility used as a residence or in an area with 2 or more single family dwellings are located on a private roadway to a candidate who has 1, organized a campaign committee under applicable federal or state law, 2, filed a financial report as required under a different statute, and 3, or filed an affidavit of candidacy for elected office. So you can look up the statute yourself, and you can see what that means. Go to the next slide. It basically means this: reasonable notice, reasonable access, reasonable time of day, with a reasonable number of volunteers. I should have added that. It's essentially that is the layman's version of Minnesota state law. As long as you provide the building owner or manager with reasonable notice, they have to provide you reasonable access, provided you're coming at a reasonable time of day and you have a reasonable number of volunteers. Reasonable, like beauty, is I guess a matter of personal opinion, so we would try to give building owners 2 to 3 days notice before we would come before we would visit a property. That would allow us to set up properly and make sure that we're not wasting our canvassers' time either. Right, we don't want to waste our candidates' time because we're standing outside the building because the building is still hemming and hawing whether they want to let us in. We don't want to waste our canvassers' time if they've signed up for a 2-hour shift or 3-hour shift. We want them on the doors. We want them talking to people. You'll notice, actually, if you go back 1 slide, please. It includes more than just apartment buildings. This applies to student housing. This applies to nursing homes. This applies to manufactured home parks. So there's lots of other kind of odd cases that are also applicable under the Minnesota state law. So the Minnesota law does require that the candidate have to be present with the volunteers, and that the building owner must will let only one candidate, like, let's say if Keith Ellison went to a multi-building unit, we could only access the one building that Keith was in at that time. So in those cases, when you've got those larger buildings, having lots of down ballot candidates is also helpful, because you're not only going to always have the congressperson or county commissioner or city council member or state house member or whomever. If it's a large complex with multiple buildings, come with multiple candidates and hit the whole thing at once is my recommendation. If you go forward two slides, please. So I alluded to this before, but I think it's very important. In order for you to use a statute effectively, you must be willing to take the apartment owner or manager to task with the petty gross misdemeanor, which is the penalty here in Minnesota. That's a penalty of $295 per instance. And so if a building tells me no, you better believe I'm going there, because I can't charge them with petty gross misdemeanor unless they've violated it. And I'll keep going back and back and back. But you need to have a candidate that's willing to do that. If a candidate says, well, gosh, I don't want the conflict and whatnot, then this program may not be the program for them. I'm sorry, this sounds a lot more aggressive than it's meant to sound, but the reality is, if you really want this to work, you've got to be willing to fight for it. And if you don't, then good luck finding another process that is as effective as actually canvassing in person in an apartment building. Yeah, as far as what the penalty is, I mean, that's obviously up to you. That's a matter for Dallas County to come up with. That's a matter for the cities in Dallas County to determine. This could be a county ordinance. This could be a city by city ordinance. But the bigger, the better. The more places you're going to be able to get in as a result of this. So let's go to the
go ahead. The
next slide, unless there's Joanna, I'll allow you to kind of keep monitor the chat and see if there's anything else there. But barring that, we can talk about why are apartments so good. One, density. The density itself justifies why we do this, why we do apartments. Two, helps you reach highly mobile populations. Apartment renters tend to skew younger and older than the general population. They're less affluent, more likely to be communities of color. Here in Minnesota, at least, I'm guessing it would be the same in Dallas County. You're also going to have higher percentages of non-native born persons living there as well. I would say that apartments are safer. They're not completely safe, obviously, but they're safer because you've got the two. If you've got the two people canvassing the same floor at the same time, literally across the hall from each other, I mean, you're maybe 6 feet away from someone else. That sounds a lot more terrifying in the time of the pandemic because we're not supposed to be within 6 feet of each other. But back in the good old days, when you could do things like restaurants and movie theaters and such, having two people very close by made it very easy to be able to canvass a floor very quickly and safely. I would argue that buildings, especially modern buildings, they're going to be ADA compliant. They have elevators, they have lighting, they have climate control. So on a hot Texas summer day, if you're knocking in an air-conditioned building, you're more likely to get a canvasser that says, yeah, I'll knock the 3 o'clock shift when it's not 110 outside. I'm inside. Your volunteers, you can get seniors who might be more interested in canvassing apartment buildings that they would not want to do a single family neighborhood because they're not actually walking that far. Women and many men just feel safer in an apartment building because of the proximity to other people. It's weatherproof, it's dark proof, and most importantly, your opponents won't even try. To the degree that opposing candidates even do any kind of field whatsoever, they're certainly not jumping through the extra hoops that you have to do to get into apartment buildings. Now, in a city like Minneapolis, which has a DPI of, I think, 78%, we didn't even bother doing the ID work when we were registering people to vote because you had a 78% chance of being a Democrat just because you were in the city. But when we're out in the suburbs, we would do that ID work first before we whipped out the voter registration form, because we're trying to have a net positive for the blue team and not for the red team. Although sometimes someone will say, well, I'm voting for the other guy. We're like, great, fill out the form and mail it in. And we'd let them do that. And that way they were responsible for getting their own form in, and they wouldn't accuse us of, destroying their right to vote or throwing away their voter registration form, which of course would be illegal. But we didn't want to even give them the opportunity to try to hang that on us.
Yeah.
I see some cut.
Yeah,
next slide, please.
There's a couple, while we get to the next slide, there's a couple of questions. Can you just really quickly, again, talk about the Minnesota statute a little bit? That you do have to have a candidate present. That's one
correct.
part, but also about having multiple candidates work a building.
Yeah, so the law says that you have to have a candidate present, but frankly, the closer you got to the election, the less likely the candidate was going to be to stay there at the same time. In fact, for our municipal elections, we got very good at being able to dispatch multiple candidates to multiple buildings, all for the same shift. So you'd have a candidate for office get us into a building, and then they would duck out while the canvass was completed. And then they'd go to a next building, and they would get a canvass going, and so on and so on. So yes, you need a candidate present. For the multi-building complexes, where you have 20 buildings, each of which have got 50 units in it. The more candidates we could bring to the building meant the quicker we could get through the entire complex. So there's a question here is about, is this feasible with 734,000 apartment complexes? I don't believe it's 734,000 apartment complexes. It's 734,000 apartment units in Dallas County. So
that's estimate. Yeah.
So it's significantly less than that. So that's individual apartment, apartment 1, apartment 2, apartment 3, 734,000 units. In Minnesota, we use an average of 2.47 residents per address, as demographically speaking. So we're talking about close to 1.5 million people. Let's say that it's that's 2 voting eligible persons, close to 1.5 million people living in those buildings, not including children or someone who might not be authorized to vote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
it's a lot. Again, folks, we're also looking at some of the statutes here in Texas. Here's the ugly part. There is nothing that is concrete in Texas with regards to this. Even the Texas GOP has within their manual for canvassers that you can go into a building because it's free speech, but to leave if there is someone aggressive. So it's both parties that are stuck in this. What do we do with no ordinance, but what's the punishment? And we're just going on a, building by building basis. I see in some of the comments is Dallas County working on an ordinance? And as far as I know, we don't know. So that's definitely a place where the county party can step in and say, we need something, or we need a clear to go ahead and start doing this, and have it understood somewhere that we aren't going to be arrested, that we aren't going to be charged with anything, that we are not going to be harassed. And can we get that anywhere in writing to protect people?
Yeah. Actually, Joanna, I'm glad. Sorry about that. It's dark here, so I figured I might as well close the blind. So I'll give you this. So in 2010, Keith Ellison hired his first apartment program person and waited until after Labor Day to do it. And so this is kind of like a GOTV tactic. And in 2012, when I started, I met with this person to ask him what his process was. And his process was boiled down to this: take up smoking. So if you go to an apartment building, just stand outside smoking a cigarette. When someone leaves, just sneak in. 2, always start on the top floor, because management tends to be on the first floor. So get through as much of the building as you can before someone complains. 3, if there's a garage, sneak in through the garage. 4, don't wear your campaign's shirt, so they won't know who's doing this. And he basically handed me a list of about, I would say, half a dozen buildings, about a dozen buildings in Minneapolis where he had figured out how to get into. And I asked him, how was it that you chose these buildings? He says, well, I live in one, my girlfriend lives in another. This is the one next to the office. So there was literally no rhyme or reason as to why he had chosen those 12, 13 buildings. It just happened to be that those were buildings that he was familiar with. They weren't even the largest buildings. They weren't even the ones with the, large POC populations. They weren't buildings with, they weren't chosen for any other reason other than, well, I've driven by it before. I knew it existed. Right. And so this is part about making this into a apartment program, is getting the information about all these buildings and then being able to do some back work in the van in order to be able to determine, is this particular building a voter reg building or a voter ID building? A building that has a higher percentage of people where you have known people, where in the voter file you have, like there's 100 units in this building and we've got information on 77 of those units. That's a high ID building. We know who these people are. We know who we're asking for. Now, in a building where that number might be reversed, where it's a 100 unit building, we only have information on 25 people. That means it's very infrequent voting building. Yes, the candidate is going to go on and talk to those 25 people who are already registered to vote, but you're going to treat that building as a voter reg building. And you're going to go in, ID, make sure that, check their party affiliation and get them signed up on the spot. So in Minnesota, we have same day registration, so it's a little different. But, if you can, to me, doing voter reg in buildings like the summer leading up to, an election is a perfect time to do it. And to successfully do apartment buildings, you're going to need to canvass the same building multiple times because you're doing it for different reasons. The first time you're going through to get IDs and voter reg. because there's constant turnover throughout the summer. You want to keep going back to the building to be able to catch the new people. And you want to go back in the early fall and make sure, okay, is this address set? And we go back through again and make sure that everyone's voter ID or voter registration is up to date to reflect their new address, so that they'll be able to vote in their new precinct.
So we did have a question about the voter registration. We want to obviously always increase voter registration, but would you suggest now be the time to go into apartments if you're going in versus ID versus registration? Let's just say we're going into voter registrate people. Is it best done this summer or now?
I don't think there's a bad.
We're in an off.
Yeah. So
this year.
Honestly, I don't think there's a bad time to do it, because you're either trying to build a relationship with the actual voter themselves, or you're trying to build a relationship with the building. You're trying to build up the calluses on your candidates, on your candidates' feet and hands from door knocking and walking through. Again, it's temperature controlled. All of this, it's a great time for you to show the apartment building owner or management company that, see, we're not barbarians, in spite of what you may have seen on Fox News. We are respectful. We're going through, and they can see that this is that this program actually benefits them as well, because it's giving order to this process, as opposed to, go into the building until someone complains and then leave. I mean, that's essentially what Keith Ellison's apartment program manager had them do back in 2010. And not surprisingly, it wasn't a very good experience for the volunteers, because they wouldn't even get through the building. And then they would, hey, run, they're calling the cops. And then then everyone goes running out of the building. And surprise, surprise, when you call them back the next week and like, hey, you want to do that again? They're like, no, that was terrible. That was an awful experience. I don't want to ever do that again. So putting some structure to this should make it a better process for your candidate, for your volunteers, for the person getting the knock, and also for the building owners.
So we're going to transition back to your presentation. Again, I see there are more questions, but we do want to get through it all. So you may be answering some of them while we're doing that. So Zach,
great.
Pull this up.
So let's talk about building your list. I would start with the voter file and take a look at, when you're doing a search function, look for any addresses that have 10 or more doors on them. What that means is 10 or more doors where there's a registered voter. So you can use that as kind of a starting point to build your spreadsheet. You're going to have the name of, or at least the address of the building. You'll be able to look what precinct and ward and district they're in. So that's going to inform which candidates are able to get in that building. This is also a great project for interns. And this is why I would say start your apartment program now, even if you're not doing the door knocking now, because it'll take a long time just to build this list properly. Because once you have addresses, then you can dispatch an intern on that and say, okay, find out what the building is called. Okay, it's located at 110 Grant Avenue, but what's the building called? Like, what would someone in the neighborhood know it as? Like, oh, that's the Marquette. Great, you want to write the Marquette. Then you want to add a phone number for the management company. Then you want to add the website. Then you want to put some demographic information about the building: senior housing, condo, HUD buildings, Section 8, public housing. These are all going to help inform your strategy when you actually get to the building itself. That's the free way you build your list, although that's not going to be comprehensive. Knowing how many doors are in the building means like how many doors at which there is a registered voter, but that doesn't actually tell you how big the building is, right? What you need is the denominator to know what priority this building is for you. And so you should be able to buy a list of apartment buildings from the city of Dallas, from Fort Worth, from Dallas County. That's something that they will sell you. And it's actually fairly cheap. I'll tell you, Ramsey County, which is where St. Paul, our capital, is located. We bought the entire list of all apartment buildings in the county, and I think it cost us $125 or $100. And they gave it to us on a flash drive. And then we had every building on there, and then we dispatch our interns on that. And then we cross-reference that number with the van. So what you can get from the city or county that you're not going to get from the van is the denominator. How many units are in this building? So if the voter file says there's 100 doors at which there's a registered voter, the information that you get from the city or county is going to tell you, yes, and that building has 275 units. So that tells you, okay, approximately 1/3 of the people living in this building are registered voters. So we need to go in there hard and hit it up as voter reg. Now, Joanna, you mentioned before about, the possibility of partnering with a nonpartisan or issue advocacy group like the League of Women Voters or something, to say, all right, let's go in there. If you can partner with them to say, all right, if the League of Women Voters can use your spreadsheet to get in to do the voter reg for you in a nonpartisan way, maybe that benefits you too, right? So you can use that as a partnership in order to be able to get to those 734,000 units. You can also buy a list from commercial sources. I've got a couple that I use. It is significantly more expensive than what you get from the city or county, but it's a nice backup plan. It does cost more money, but you can talk to these companies, say, I want a list of all the apartment buildings in Dallas County, and then you can cross-reference that against the van or even what the city or county gives you. It does cost a little more. What I will say is, as far as you've got your membership, you've got your donors for the DCDP, for the Texas Democratic Party, you can use this as a fundraiser. Hey, we are seeking to organize in apartment buildings and it's going to cost us X amount of money. Please, buy a building. That'll cost you $100 or buy, you know what I mean? Like, it's one thing to say, hey, DCDP would like you to make a donation because we're doing important things. It's another thing to say, here is exactly how your money is being spent. It's not on copy toner and copy paper. It's to get into apartments so we can organize renters, so we can turn them out and we can turn Texas blue. That's something I think that folks in Texas can get behind. That's something that folks nationally can get behind, to say, gosh, we were closer than we've been in a very long time to winning Texas on the top of the ticket this past time. If this plan was in place in Harris County, if this was in place in Dallas County, it could make a meaningful difference for the election.
We have the apartment units to swing an election in
Yeah.
Dallas County alone. In Dallas County
Yeah.
alone, we have that ability. So yay,
Yeah.
keep going.
That doesn't surprise me at all. So and Joanna, here's a situation where although you're obviously your candidate for statewide office, whether it's running against Greg Abbott or your senators, whoever is running on the Democratic side, you say, hey, let's partner on this thing. Like, when you're working in Dallas County, we want you to be working apartments, right? And I really think there's a lot of value in saying, all right, we've got a person for Dallas County. Maybe it's too big, maybe it's by individual city, but you have that way, like you said, apartment building owners are not, or managers are not getting calls from 16 different campaigns all trying to get into the same building. When you have this unified list, your apartment program manager, when you have all of the information, what's the building called, what's the address, what's the precinct, ward, etc., that informs which candidates can get you into the building. You sort it by size, you sort it by how many units are in the building or how many doors are in the building. And then the apartment program manager would say, okay, candidate X would like to go canvassing with us. What is the largest building in that candidate's jurisdiction that we have not yet visited? And that's the building that we're going to. And so having it centralized and having a single apartment program manager at central command, making sure, we're making sure we're not going to back to a building a second time before we've gone to all of the buildings first time. And you could set a threshold. You could say, okay, our threshold is maybe buildings of only 100 units or more, or 100 doors or more, because it takes just as much work to get into a 20-unit building as it does to get into a 1,000-unit building. So let's get into our big ones first. Let's work through that list, and you have to determine where you want that cutoff to be. So this speaks to this leads to the last bullet point, which is, once you've got both the numerator and denominator together, then you can compare the number of doors versus units to see if the building is going to be like a high ID building or high persuasion building or a high voter reg building, and then you plan accordingly from there.
Do we have another slide?
I'm happy to go to the next slide, but I'll pause just in case there's anything that you thought needed to be addressed at this time.
Okay, yes, here's a good one. Zach, if we want to stop this slide, this is a really good question. At some point, describe the conversation that takes place with the canvas, asking opinions or selling an agenda. Let's say we're in now, I'm in the, what is that conversation like at the door? I mean, I'm comfortable talking through it at homes, but talk a little bit about that. We've gotten into apartments in Dallas County. To do this, we will have a lot of renters who are not used to this type of canvassing. They are not used to people being in the building. So describe what that conversation is like. There are two different conversations. So persuasion and making sure you vote for my person versus, hey, are you even a registered voter? What party? So let's start with the first one. I'm coming in as a generic, this is a voter ID building and registration building. What's that conversation going to look like?
So honestly, I think in order to be successful in the building, you have to, that's where the pre-work for the building comes into play, because that you know what type of building it is before you go in there. You know, okay, we're gonna need a multilingual SWAT team in order to go into this building. There's a lot of Anglo, but a lot of Spanish speakers in this building as well. So we need to have that multilingual capability on site in the team. So if I come to a door and in Minnesota, the issue is with Somali or Hmong or Spanish less so, but Somali and Hmong, making sure that we have someone who speaks Somali or Hmong in the team. Now, when you call the building to set up the appointment in the first place is when you send the building the statute. It's when you explain to them, you know, you are required by law to let us in and we will be there. So plan accordingly. What we do is we provide the actual statute itself on the back of our clipboards that we provide our canvassers. So if anyone at the door has any questions, what are you doing here? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, state law says I'm allowed to be here. But by that point, it's almost too late. So by calling the apartment building in advance, you have the opportunity to be able to say to the building, you know what I've found to be very helpful in the other buildings where we've done this already is I've provided the building with some language to explain the state statute, explain your obligation as the building manager and owner to let us in, and that the resident of the building is under no obligation to open the door for us, answer any of our questions or anything. And it's amazing because it's kind of like putting a worm on a hook for a fish, because when you tell the building, hey, here's a thing for my candidate, you should put this around the building in your common areas so that your residents aren't surprised when we go door knocking. You'll find in buildings that they not only will they put the sign in the elevator and in the laundry room and by the mailboxes, but some buildings will put it literally under every single door of every resident in the building, thereby giving your candidate 5 days of free advertising. Attention, attention, Keith Ellison, your congressman, is coming to this building this Saturday. And he'll be here between 1 and 3 p.m. State law requires we let them in. State law does not require you speak with them. I mean, it's amazing because the buildings will do the advertising for you, and I think that has two effects. One, for your candidate, it's free advertising. Two, for the opposition, their backers who live in that building will be like, well, why isn't my guy come knocking? Why didn't my guy come ask my opinion on such and such bill, or ask my opinion on climate change, or ask me what my favorite Ted Cruz meme in Cancun was, right? Like, why are the Democrats doing this, right? So it has an ability to be able to kind of lift up your supporters and people who should be your supporters, but it also has a demoralizing effect on the other side, because they're like, gosh, I mean, I don't like the Democrats, but at least they're asking people what they think. You know, so laying that groundwork beforehand really makes all the difference in the world. Otherwise, the conversation itself is exactly the same. Our script is exactly the same in an apartment building as it would be at a single family home. Are you the person that's registered to vote at this address? How do you ID? By party. Are you planning on voting? You are a Democrat. Okay, well, maybe you're not a Democrat. Maybe you're just a guy. What are your issues? Great. These are your issues. Okay, excellent. My candidate is for the following things. The only thing that's different is that we're organizing vertically as opposed to horizontally.
So a lot
And
of
then
yeah.
yeah, the B script is a little different. But what I mean by the B script is when you go into an apartment building, since we don't know when we're going to get back to this place, it doesn't make sense to limit ourselves only to the people who are already registered to vote, because some buildings that number could be a quarter or a third or a half. That would mean that we're missing 2/3 or half or a third of the people. So as long as we're there, we might as well go and try to register the people at the doors where we do not have any information. So the only different deviance in the or difference in the script there is I'm Andrew, I'm with the Dallas County Democratic Party, or I'm with the such and such campaign, and we're here today talking with voters about issues that are facing them right now. Are you planning on being a voter? Okay, well, according to our records, we don't have anyone registered to vote at this address. If you do your voter ID and they say yes, I'm a Democrat, or at least no, I don't hate Democrats, then you can go into, hey, you know what? I can get you registered to vote right here on the spot. Let's get you signed up. Let's get this taken care of right now. The one thing I would say with apartment buildings is that you want to always be prepared that the sorry, it's my mom calling. Otherwise, I wouldn't even push that away. So otherwise, you take the voter registration script is just, let's get you registered to vote. You want to make sure that you have both a digital and analog version. So you want to have both a printed copy of the voter file for that particular building, as well as a digital version. So if you use the minivan, just understand that in some buildings the reception isn't great, and you don't want to find yourself in a building without reception, so you don't know which doors you should and shouldn't be going to. So having a paper backup with you, I think, is also tremendously helpful to make sure it's smooth. But the conversation itself is exactly the same as if you were talking to someone in a single family home out in the suburbs.
Yeah, yeah. So we did have a comment about Section 8 housing. Just in Dallas, has been more luck because the housing authority does allow voter registration. They do like coordination first and trusted entities first to do that. Plus, we do have precinct chairs that are located in some of these housing complexes that do it on their own as well. So for those that you had a question, that is something that we have been able to work with in Dallas County. It's just a constant, you don't do it once and forget it. It's a constant necessity because of the residents that are coming in and out so quickly.
Absolutely.
And there's no rhyme or reason to when someone's moving or being evicted or whatever. It's constant need in housing complexes like that as well.
So I'll tell you, in Minnesota, at least, the turnover is 10% per month is the turnover, and it's not evenly distributed throughout the year. In Minnesota, you're not allowed to move into a new apartment building, or generally apartments will not accept new residents between October and May because of this thing called winter, which you all are just discovering now, of snow and the mush and all the horribleness, right?
A whole week of it.
Yeah. So in Minnesota, you can't move in during winter. So all of that moving happens basically May through September. So 4 months is when all that turnover happens. So the average renter lives in a place for 1.7 years, which means by the time the congressional candidate is up for re-election, the entire building has moved out. On average. So this is a program that is perfect for an off year, right? If you have municipal elections, great. But even if you don't, building those relationships and learning how to do this and making sure you have a good list, so when you are an election year, then you can spring to and you can start knocking right away once your candidates are all nominated and once they're all known. Frankly, this is a tool that your candidates who are running for office should be doing as well if they're in a Democratic primary. But I'm not interested in blue on blue violence, but or competition. But smart progressive campaigns will use this campaign in order to get the nomination as well, to get the delegates, to get the votes, to win the primary in order to be able to get to be in the general election.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do when we were as part of our discussion today was to bring you here so that we could have a coordinated effort. What sometimes happens is one organization, one precinct chair, one neighborhood captain can get in a building here, has talked to a manager there, has their own research strategy here, and that's great until turnover happens, until you move, until you lose your data, and there's no centralized way to do it. And that's what we're also trying to get here as well, as sort of a cohesive approach to this, because I think we could all benefit. What could happen and may happen is if a campaign goes into a building, the manager has a horrible experience with them, it may sour the ability for others to go in. And we
Absolutely.
can't, to be successful, it does benefit us to work together. And we have some other folks here from other counties who are also listening to the discussion. They've asked for your slides, which we will share with them as well. But we do have the opportunity here to sort of pilot out this in Dallas County in certain areas where I think that we could be successful, where we do already have some apartment organizations that are open to this kind of canvassing effort. So I'm glad that we were able to do that with you as well. If you want to get back to the slide, Zach, do we have any more in the slide left?
Now, and that's a really good point, Joanna. It's something you might want to consider. Like, I would say your apartment program organizer or apartment program manager should probably be an experienced field organizer, right? This is not a great place to cut your teeth to learn how to canvass, because this is canvassing plus, because there's the other elements associated with this. So if DCDP was to fund this position, or if the coordinated campaign was to and say, hey, Texas Democratic Party and DCDP was to fund something like this, and or we got these various campaigns who all wanted to participate in it to fund this one specific position, and then we're all signing up to use this. We're all agreeing that we're going to do this. We're going to carry each other's lit. We're going to do this, and we're all going to go through the one apartment program manager for Dallas County. So much the better. So then you have one person with kind of the 10,000-foot view of what's happening all around the county. So
Great.
On to the next slide, please. So our process in Minnesota, although this is not mandated by statute, is we schedule our appointments 48 to 72 hours in advance. We must have candidate present. We assign an experienced canvasser to work with the candidate. Now, this is important. So your apartment program manager does not have to be the actual person actually also doing the door knocking. In fact, if this is successful, your apartment program manager is sitting safely in an office somewhere while multiple buildings all across the county are all being knocked by multiple campaigns every single weekend, every night, all over the place. And the apartment program manager's job is to take that call when someone says, hey, they're not letting us in, or hey, someone's calling the cops, or hey, what do we do about X? That if your apartment program manager is actually on the doors themselves, they're less useful because they can't respond to that because they're knocking the door themselves. So something to consider. When you have a candidate in the building, I always pair either like a super volunteer with them, or at a minimum an experienced canvasser to work with the candidate. That way the candidate's not having to remember also, how do I pull this up on the van, or what's my next question or whatnot. At least here in Minnesota, I mean, a fair amount candidates are undisciplined as far as that is. They see a person and they just want to have to start talking, right, and not going to necessarily go through the script. So that way their scribe, this super vol or experienced canvasser has got the script, and as the candidate's talking with the person, you're just kind of marking down, oh, environment, women's rights, racial justice, $15 minimum hour. You're marking down the issues that this person's talking about as you're going through. Yes, they're planning on voting for. Yes, they're planning on voting. They don't know if they're voting for us. All of those. And so your experienced canvasser is doing that. And in fact, Martin Sabo, who was the U.S. Congressperson before Keith Ellison, he had a famous method called the Sabo method. What he would do with an apartment building is he would go into an apartment building with two canvassers. They would knock every door, and the candidate would walk the middle of the floor. And when someone would answer the door, the candidate would go right to that person. And you can actually employ that in this program as well. So if you have the one person is knocking all the doors in the voter file, and you have the other person knocking all the doors that aren't in the voter file, anytime you get a human at the door, you can say, hold on a second, Joanna. Hey, Keith, I'd like to introduce you to somebody. Come over here. Keith, this is Joanna. Joanna, this is Keith. This is your congressperson. Keith, go ahead. And that way it's a very high touch situation where the person the person who answered the door is like, wow, I got a door knock today from my city council member or from my county commissioner or from a candidate for Congress or a candidate for the Senate. That's kind of cool. And so it's almost like it's like a concept of like a dialer, except it's manifested in the flesh. You've got the door knockers just trying to find someone at the door, and then the candidate goes to the door where the person answers. Obviously, your candidate can only do that on one floor at a time. But let's say if there's another canvassing team on another floor and someone says, you know, actually, I do have a very specific question for the congressperson or for the senator or for whatnot, then they can send a text down and say, hey, when you have a moment, please send the candidate to apartment 302. Miss Smith would like to ask him a question. And then you can send the candidate up there, and then he or she can knock on the door like, you had a question for me. I'm really the candidate. How can I help you? What was your question? So this is what we ended up calling the reverse knock, was knocking the doors which are not in the voter file. And you just need a process by which you capture that information. So if they're not in the voter file and you get their voter registration there, if under Texas law, you're allowed to make a copy of that, or if you take down that information separately. So now you're essentially adding it to the My Campaign side of the van. They're not a registered voter already, so they're not there, but you don't want to lose their information as to like what their issues are, what they care about, and what have you. So on to the next slide. We're getting to the end here.
Okay, perfect.
So schedule the building in advance. Figure out which buildings in the district haven't been canvassed. Schedule the largest building that any given candidate has not yet been to, or any candidate has been to. So in Minnesota, in the 5th congressional district, I think we had 26 cooperating campaigns. They were judicial campaigns, they were state house campaigns, city council campaigns, park board campaigns. I mean, literally all up and down the ticket, and the congressman himself. And like your at-large candidates are gold, because they can get into any district, they can get into any building in that district, right? As opposed to, well, I'm running for school board in District 1, so I can only get into District 1 buildings. So your at-large candidates are going to be very, very useful in this regard, in order to use them as a wild card in order to be able to get into a building you might not otherwise be able to get in. Provide the building management with a courtesy call and give them the pre-written notification for the residents. And that would say, essentially, attention residents of the Nakoma. Minnesota, the statute requires that we let you in, that we let the candidate in. They're coming at this time, at this date and time. You're not required to speak to them. If you have any problems, please contact the apartment program manager for the campaign and put his or her phone number and email address on it. And so the building management can issue their complaints that way, or the residents can call and say, I don't want any Democrats in my building. Okay, well, great. Well, that's fine. Giving people advance notice that we're coming, you'll be surprised that most people did not want to fight with us. If they didn't want to talk to us, they simply didn't answer the door, and that's also fine too. Yeah. Next slide. So day before, you're comparing van records with the number of units. It's going to help you figure out how many potential voter registrations you're going to have in the building, let you know how many voter reg forms you're going to need. Confirm the appointment with the building management and ask who is going to be the point of contact when you're physically at the building. Because it's okay if Mary, the apartment building manager, has said yes to this. If George the doorman or George the whatever person in the leasing office happens to be there on site, you want to know who that person is. So when you come in, you say, Mary said it was okay for us to be here, and I was told to ask for George. That's going to get you a lot further to get into that front of that building on time and on schedule than if you don't have a specific name of, well, who was it that we got permission from? When did we talk to them? Who did they tell us to talk to? We have a phone number for George, but we also have a phone number for the weekend for Mary, the manager. So if George is like, I never got that memo, we're like, great, let's call Mary right now. And Mary can confirm that I'm not lying. And we do have an appointment. So that's strongly, strongly recommended. Next screen, please. So Day of Canvas, explaining the knock versus reverse knock concept is something that you're doing with your volunteers. And then you provide all of your canvassers with the actual statute itself, and you can actually tape that to the back of the clipboard. If someone asks a question, what are you doing here, or what gives you the authority to do this, you've got it in writing already. But that's not something that we lead with when we're doing the canvassing. We act as if everything is normal. When we started doing this in 2012, buildings had never been canvassed before. Like, I know the very first building I ever knocked in, woman says, I've lived here for 30 years. This is the first political candidate that's ever knocked on my door. She's like, come on in. Let me give you biscotti and tea. Right? It's like, great. And I brought the candidate with me, and we had a great time, and we enjoyed our biscotti. And God bless Helen Davis, because she was awesome, and she was very receptive. And here she living in one of the larger buildings in Minneapolis, had never ever once heard from a candidate. Now, she happened to be very solidly on the blue team, but no candidate had ever had a chance to have a face-to-face with her at her own residence. So she was actually very excited that was an opportunity.
Yeah. So we're going to stop this screen share now because we are heading to our end. I want to answer a few questions before we do stop. Yes, we will be providing the recorded version of the discussion and a follow-up email if you have signed up with us through Mobilize America, because that's the best way for us to stay in touch with you, as well as a copy of the slides as well. A couple of other questions. How do you know if a candidate has canvassed that area or that building? Again, this is part of the organizing effort that we're doing in Dallas County, because we would like to organize an advanced effort. We have really not done this as a county effort. Most of the time it's campaigns, ducking in and ducking out, just like what was happening that you were experiencing in Minnesota. And it was difficult. It is still difficult. And so what we are trying to do is have this discussion, but we aren't the only ones who need this information. If we can move forward now as a county and look at, see the notes that we have good relationships with our commissioners, and talk with them about what this will mean, because it will mean that we are also paving the way for the opponents as well. The Republicans will do this too. They're not going to sit on the sidelines. They're watching this conversation too. So we know that. So we're opening the door, but we're, a good metaphor, we are opening the door that should have been open to us all along, and we shouldn't be sitting here not letting it happen. So I want to make sure that we put that out there as well, that we will share this, because we have folks from all over who are watching this discussion with us. Andrew, how long did it take this program that you started working for you to see real traction happening? So this is 2012, you're first really going in a real concentrated effort, not the sneakies under the gate, but how long before you really saw?
It was 6 weeks from the time I was hired till the first apartment canvass we did. It was 6 weeks to build our list, meet with the candidates, set up appointments, and just get out there and do it. It was Cinco de Mayo was the first day that we did it, and I think I was brought on or around St. Patty's Day. Mm-hmm. So it was like 6 weeks until we did our first buildings. And the best way to learn is by doing, and you're going to so by getting out there and doing it quicker, you're going to learn those lessons quicker, so you can replicate this. Having some eager candidates who are willing to champion it is going to make all the difference, because they can tell the other candidates, or they can tell the other elected officials, like, guys, I did it. It's great. It's amazing. We did 200 doors in an hour. And you'd never be able to do that out in the suburbs. You'd never be able to do that in the single family turf, because you don't have to walk very far between, apartment 1 and apartment 2 versus, house 1 and house 2. So the sooner you do it, the better. Deploying armies of interns on the kind of the data management piece of this is going to be really crucial as well. Getting an experienced organizer in position, I really believe that this is something that you should start before the electoral cycle, so that list is being built. So when you're ready to, when the starter gun goes off, that your candidates are ready to go, as opposed to starter gun goes off and then you start building your list of apartments.
So here's the last questions that I have, because one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is because you are a believer like me in door-to-door, face-to-face, in-person canvassing. But is there an option to not? I mean, we have some tools like Map the Vote or Register the Vote where you can just blanket email or send or text registration links. I will say, in preface to that, I want folks to know this. This is statistics from the League of Women Voters. Just in 2020 alone, in Dallas County, of the 212,000 people who submit a voter registration application was submitted, only 75,000 were actually processed in the 10 months before the election. Overwhelmingly, white back forms, which don't require an actual registrant, were rejected. Overwhelmingly. And the state has also, with Map the Vote, for instance, it's a tool that we sometimes use. It won't allow you now to just anonymously send a registration application to a person you think might have moved. They actually have to have their name on it. So talk to me about why you all chose to invest in this in-person effort versus just digitizing it, texting and blanketing with just registration applications.
Because there's no higher impact way to reach a voter than by speaking to them face to face. And especially, again, because of demographics of the people who live in apartment buildings, Democrats tend to live in more dense living situations. There's a political scientist from George Washington University who's actually calculated he can predict what the voter whether Democrat or Republican will win based on the density of a given census tract. And I think that number is like 2,000 people per square mile is kind of like that magic number. If it's more than 2,000 people per square mile, it will vote Democrat. If it's less than 2,000, then it's more likely to vote Republican. So this is yeah, I mean this is absolutely very labor intensive, but again, for these highly mobile populations that we're talking about, people who are renters, people who do move around a lot, people, young people with multiple jobs and working and going to school, and young families and such, we're simply not reaching them if we're trying to call them. We're not reaching them if we're sending them an email or a text. The high touch of actually talking to a candidate face to face, talking to a campaign face to face. We even found this in 2012. Again, people were surprised that we were knocking on their door because they're like, well, I've never had a candidate actually ask me before what I think about something. This could be real high impact for you as well. Again, yeah, I tremendously successful. It's now a staple of our not only congressional campaigns, our Unified Democratic Party in Minnesota uses this. Our local Democratic Party for the city of Minneapolis or Hennepin County uses this. They use this for municipal elections, county elections, city elections, state elections. It's not appropriate for all areas of the state. It's not appropriate for all areas of Dallas County. But for your denser areas, I mean, you know your areas best, and you might know, like, hey, this is a high DPI Democratic tract. Let's make sure that we get all the buildings in that tract first, even if they might not be the largest buildings in Dallas County, but those should be the ones with the most voter-rich opportunities for us. Let's get into these buildings first, and then that's again, we're getting a experienced field organizer who understands the principles of organizing already, to then apply that and take that to the next level to make those determinations, to do the prioritization for which buildings do we go to first, is essential to make this work.
So the last question, and this is a good one. Have your Republican in Minnesota, do the Republicans in Minnesota use this method? Have they figured it out?
No.
Why? Why don't they?
No, they don't use it. They don't do field here. They don't door knock. They use checkbook diplomacy. They send money to the Republican Party so they can spend money on radio ads or television ads, but they don't door knock, and they're definitely not door knocking in the city. So this is a tool that we use here in Minnesota in order to be able to turn statewide elections, whether the governor's race, AG's race, the defeating the constitutional amendment to limit marriage between one man and one woman, or requiring a government-issued photo ID. The 5th congressional district was the difference of whether or not we won or lost those ballot measures as well, because we've got the density of population here, just like you do in Dallas County. You're so much more dense than many parts of Texas. Houston is way more dense. I understand that's Harris County, but those major metropolitan centers, you have the ability to be able to flip statewide races if you can turn out your people to vote, and your people live in apartments, even if they don't know they are your people.
Yeah, so I appreciate you so much. I've taken all these notes, Andrew. I know that we couldn't meet in person, but I feel as motivated as everybody else on this call, and appreciate you so much for agreeing to switch it up a little bit for us when we were having some weather issues. I'm excited about what the possibility is here for us. I'm so glad that I was told about you and that you took the moments to talk with us. Again, I want to thank everybody who's attended tonight. We will follow up with you with a recorded and edited version of the video. We have to match the audio with the video to make it sound well. And also, Andrew, add some of your slides with your permission to that too. But I hope that this isn't the last time that we see you. I mean, we're definitely wanting to pilot this out here. We think that this urban center, Dallas County was one of the earliest counties in Texas, if not the earliest, to flip, and it has been for a long time. And we do have the ability to swing some of these elections, but we've just not, I mean, there's a lot to do in Texas and a lot we're fighting with, but we also need more tools in our toolbox. And this is definitely a totally awesome conversation, and I appreciate you so much for being here with us tonight.
Well, and please, I hope that we can continue this conversation as well. Anyone who's on this call, my contact information is included in my slide deck. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or need clarification on anything. Send me an email, send me or give me a call. Happy to help you, and I'm excited to see Dallas County taking the lead on this in Texas. And once you've got it all figured out, then you can show those guys in Harris County how things are really done, and then get them on board, and then truly flip the state blue. So thank you all very much for your time.
Yes, thank you all so much. Again, we appreciate you. We will follow up. Andrew, I will let you get back to your phone call with your mom and get some rest before you get back into the field as well. So thank you all so much. We will be ending tonight, and we will be in touch soon. Bye.
Thanks, Joanna.
Uh-huh.